All right, so if you've got water that has chlorine or chloramine in it, you want to off-gas that for 24 to 48 hours. You can either just let it sit out for a couple days and the chlorine should off-gas. So chlorine is meant to kill bacteria that's in the water so that we don't get that bacteria in us and get sick, but we're trying to grow bacteria and it would be working against us. Or you can put your air pump on in the water for 12 hours and that should off-gas it as well. And then another way, if you weren't able to off-gas it, you can bind up the chlorine molecules with humic acid. And I'm going to be mentioning humic acid as a food for microbes anyway, for fungi. So just a tiny bit of humic acid, enough to tint the water a different color, is going to be enough to bind up the ions in the chlorine. And I'm not able to describe how that happens chemically, but that's what happens. And then you want to brew at the same ambient temperature as what you are applying to your plants. So if you're going to be applying to plants in a greenhouse, you want to brew in the greenhouse and apply to those greenhouse plants. If you're going to be applying outdoors, then you want to be brewing outdoors. And Elaine had found this out, just to give you an example of why. I think it was the Bellagio, it was either the Mirage or the Bellagio in Las Vegas that Elaine was working with and got them set up with a tea program to brew and apply compost tea for their landscape. And they were going very well. And then a few months into it, she must have gotten it going in the wintertime. And then a few months into it, they were starting to experience some issues. I don't know what the outcome was or why they were having issues, or what the issues were, but they were having issues that they reported to her. And she's trying to problem solve and figure out what was going on. And she finally went and visited them and realized that it had gotten so hot because they're in the desert in the summertime that they were like, well, it's too hot to brew outside. We're going to move our brewer indoors so that we're cooler and brew indoors. But then they were taking that stuff that had been brewed in a climate-controlled setting, and is at 70 degrees or whatever, out into 95, 100 plus degree temperatures and spraying that out and having detrimental effects. So you want to brew at the same temperature that you're going to be applying to plants. I'm in Nashville area, and I stop brewing normally in October or November and don't start again until March or April. We set our refrigerators to refrigerate food. Again, I'm using the food analogy. We set our refrigerators at about 45 degrees or a little bit less, because below 45 degrees is when the food's going to stay good from being eaten by microorganisms. And that means that under those temperatures, the microorganisms are being slowed down so much that they're not going to be consuming stuff. So my thought is that if outside, or the soil temperatures at least, are going to be 45 degrees or below, or especially freezing, you're not going to be wanting to brew and apply compost tea. Now in the fall and the winter is a good time to put down compost for your plants, because throughout the winter the biology from the compost is going to get worked down into the soil, and snow cover also helps to insulate that and helps to work that biology down into the soil throughout the winter. All right, so foods for microbes. I'm sometimes hesitant to put this up here because a lot of people are getting away from recommending using blackstrap molasses, but the best food for bacterial foods is unsulfured blackstrap molasses. A lot of people are not recommending this anymore because if you were to have a pathogen in your compost and pathogenic bacteria in your compost and you're trying to brew tea, you're just going to agitate the situation by breeding bad microbes through the use of unsulfured blackstrap molasses. I'm checking everything with a microscope, and if people were to be checking things with a microscope and knew what they were doing, then you shouldn't be breeding anything bad. And I've never, in all my experience, had any issues with anything negative. Like I mentioned, we're also trying to usually get more fungi going through compost or compost tea. And I normally have enough bacteria, so I really don't have to worry about that much bacterial food. I'm not too concerned about it. Plus, some of the foods for fungi also work as bacterial foods. So when I'm using unsulfured blackstrap molasses, I'll use about a teaspoon or no more in 5 gallons. And I'll use about 3 tablespoons or no more for 50 gallons. 3 tablespoons or less. It really doesn't take much. You also have to consider with some of these blackstrap molasses, especially fish hydrolysate, the more you add, first of all, we're working with microorganisms which are microscopic, obviously. and it's really not going to take much to feed them. So I'll brew, and like I said, I'll dilute down after my brew to get water sprayed out, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on that, but I'll add some more foods to help feed those microbes in the future. But if you get too much fish hydrolysate or molasses into the mix, you're going to leave some sticky residue on the insides of your spray tanks and stuff like that. That can be really hard to clean out and a pain in the butt that it's just too hard to deal with. It's easier to keep your foods to a minimum. So foods for fungi are going to be humic acid, fish hydrolysate, kelp, and feather meal. Fish hydrolysate is different from fish emulsion. A lot of times when you go to your garden store, what they're selling are fish emulsion because it's cheaper to buy and sell fish emulsion. Fish emulsion is when you have a fish and you remove all the fats and the oils from it and blend that up. Fish hydrolysate is when you take the entire fish with the fats and the oils and stuff like that for proteins, and you're blending up an entire fish, so it's a little bit more expensive. And then kelp, it's good to look for kelp that has had some of the salt removed because kelp is sitting in the ocean, so it's going to be full of salt from the salt water, although it's a little bit different in the way that type of salt works. It can be beneficial in small, it's going to be beneficial in small amounts. And then with fungal foods, I'm doing a tablespoon of each fungal food for 5 gallons. So I'll use a tablespoon of humic acid, I'll use a tablespoon of fish hydrolysate, and I'll use a tablespoon of kelp. And that's all you don't need to add a ton of foods. The more foods you add, the more likely that you're gonna go anaerobic more quickly because your microorganisms are gonna be using all that food. At a certain point, your brew goes anaerobic. So what we're trying to do is feed the microorganisms and get them to reproduce to a peak population. And then at a certain point, they're going to reach a peak population, and it's going to be different all the time. It's just kind of a matter of experience of checking it with a microscope. And then after that peak population, the oxygen gets used up and the air gets used up, and you get a drop in biology, and it goes anaerobic, and you're going to start making anaerobic microorganisms at that point. And another good thing that I found out a long time ago is to use a handful of straw. If you ever read Teeming with Microbes, they talk about a protozoan infusion, and they use green material. We did a little bit of experimenting at Rodale of using fresh green material versus straw, and straw seemed to work a lot better. So in a 5-gallon bucket, you really, I mean, it's just a tiny amount. It's hard to even tell you, but just a handful in the bottom of the bucket or in your brew bag, and then that helps to get a bacterial boom, which then increases the protozoa, which is normally the flagellates that are going to increase. I had one guy back here first. Yes?
You mean just straight pine straw?
Not pine straw, straw.
Oh, straw.
Wheat straw, yeah.
Straw. Okay.
Yep. What was your question?
I've read before to use fresh comfrey. That's the same. Is that true? Do you know?
People use comfrey and make teas out of comfrey. I've never tested it for the biology. I know it's supposed to increase like the nutrients and minerals in it, but I don't know about the biology. I can't answer that.
What about also adding other things like azomite or soft rock phosphate?
Oh yeah, I will add azomite. So Elaine teaches in her classes that, I'm saying that Elaine teaches this, I don't teach this. Elaine teaches that all soils have nutrients in there. It's just a matter of getting the biology to access those nutrients and minerals in the soils. And I don't necessarily think that's true, and I've heard a lot of debate about that. And so I like to add azomite. I feel like it's a waste if I'm adding azomite. For all those who aren't familiar, azomite's A to Z minerals, and it's rock dust. If I'm putting it into my brew, when I'm brewing 5 gallons or 50 gallons, when I'm done, there's a little bit of sludge that's left on the bottom of the bucket normally. And my thought is that if I'm adding azomite in there, however much of that azomite is going to collect in the bottom in that stuff, and it's just going to be a waste of my money. So after I put that into my spray tank, then I put the azomite in and mix it up real well so that I know that I'm getting it along with my spray. We kind of experimented with different stuff like green material versus brown material, and for some reason the straw seemed to work better to provide the protozoa. This is just a little chart for anybody. I mean, most of you aren't going to have a microscope to be checking this for peak population. And from my experience of years of brewing and using a microscope to check populations of microorganisms, this is a rule of thumb that I've come up with that you can go by. And so this is an average 24-hour temp from day to night. So if just say tomorrow, I think it's supposed to start off at like 40 degrees and then it's going to get up to 60. So then the average is obviously 50 degrees or about that. You want to go by a whole 24-hour period, not just the day high, but the day high and the day low. So in this time of year, in March and April, I'm brewing for 72 hours. When this is about my average temp, and I said this is a rule of thumb, there's always fluctuations of this that mess it up. 66 to 80 degrees about is going to take about 2 days, 81 to 90 a day, and the hotter, the less time. So the colder it is outside, the more oxygen is available, and also the slower the microorganisms move or are active. The hotter it is, the more active the microorganisms are and the less oxygen is in the air. So it's going to brew a lot faster and go anaerobic a lot faster. So it takes a lot shorter time in a warmer temperature. Yes?
I'm really puzzled by this because we've been using the heater on the brewer and just doing it at 70 degrees. But in the summertime, the sun may hit it and it may get up to more like 80 or something for a little while. But mostly it's brewing at 70. And Meredith has been looking with the microscope at our batches, and our diversity and our life drops off after 12 to 14 hours. We're brewing for 12 to 14 hours and we max out there. If we went 48 hours, there'd be nothing there. They'd be shot. I'm wondering if it's just because we have a better, maybe more air.
But that's consistent 70?
Yeah, it was, well, consistent 70 till the sun hits it. And then it may jump for a couple hours, but usually we're putting it out in the morning, so it's only going to be, it's going to go to 80 for maybe an hour or two before it goes out. And sometimes not. Sometimes we brew it into the evening, and so it's just a consistent 70.
Yeah.
You know, and so we hear these longer times, and we start that way. But Mary was just checking it all the time because we weren't getting good results, and we found our sweet spot to be like 12 to 14 hours.
Yeah, and if you have a microscope, I mean, it's good to be checking like that because it's going to be different. That's why I said this is a rule of thumb. This is what I have found throughout my experience. The issue that I've always had, is like, my brewer's sitting out in the shade part of the day, and then the sun hits it, and then for whatever reason, it's like extremely warm for a few hours, and then overnight it gets really cold. So that you've got such a fluctuation all the time that you kind of gotta. There's a learning curve there that you got to catch on to. But I'm not sure. It's got me wondering what's going on there.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's still a mystery. Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
If you're the type of person who we know is never going to use a microscope.
So her question was, if you aren't ever going to use a microscope or buy a microscope or whatever, where should you end? And is it better to err on the shorter side? And yes, I'm glad you brought that up because it's better to brew it for less time and not worry about going over and going anaerobic because you're going to do good with the microorganisms you had. So like I brought up the extract before, with the extract, you're just going to have the population of microorganisms that are there. And we were working with a guy, large scale, who was a farmer in the 70s. He was a chemical salesman. He's done research with Monsanto, and he's done research with Penn State, both of who are chemical people. And just doing extract with him at 5 gallons per acre, he noticed it without even getting his numbers back for his yield. He noticed visually that he had more of a crop. And so, yeah, to me, I mean, if you're airing, you're still getting the microorganisms, and usually soils haven't had the benefit of microorganisms, so any little bit's going to help them. Yeah.
So if you end up accidentally doing it too long and it's become anaerobic, does that actually hurt the plants, or just is it giving them the good stuff?
Yes, it could hurt. It would be it most likely would be detrimental. Yeah, because you've got anaerobic microorganisms in there, which you don't want to be putting into your soil.
So then it's rather safe than sorry number of times?
Yeah, so it's better just to do it for 12 or 24 hours. And like he said, and Pat was saying, they hit, was it 24 hours?
No, we're hitting our sweet spot at 12.
At 12 to 14, okay. So yeah, I mean like 12 hours then.
But Troy, before we had a microscope, the way I told, and I never saw bad effect from it, was I would notice this fish smell when I put the fish in the tea, and then I'd come back and I'd smell it a lot. And when I no longer smelled fish, and it started to smell like the healthy side of a stream, I'd say that's it, and I'd do it there. You know, so if you're not using a microscope, I think you can use your nose to get pretty accurate anyway.
Yeah. So he was saying he used his nose to determine, and once he used fish hydrolysate, and once the fishy smell went away, then he thought that it was done. And I would agree. You can always use your nose if it smells bad, if it smells like something that you wouldn't want to. I mean, not that you want to consume dirt, but if it's something that makes you sick in any way or not feel well, then you wouldn't want to apply it to plants. Yeah, there's a certain smell that I don't know how to describe it either, but I kind of know like a certain smell that I think it's starting to, there's a certain smell where if I look at it, it's like a straw smell that, a wet straw smell that when I smell that, I know I'm going to probably, or it's starting to go anaerobic.
And are there any visual symptoms, like signs?
No, that's what makes it tough, yeah. And also, like, if you watch YouTube videos, this kind of drives me crazy. If you watch, and this is why I don't put stuff on YouTube, because there's a whole bunch of yahoos out there. I mean, there's good stuff. Living Web Farm puts stuff on YouTube. There's great content on YouTube. I'm just saying that there's a bunch of people that put stuff up on YouTube, and it makes me not want to use like that type of thing.
So we have a good reputation.
Yeah. So a lot of people, if you'll watch these people that make compost tea, and they're like, oh, look at all those bubbles. Like they think that something about compost tea bubbling up shows that it has good biology, and it's the same thing as when you put a straw in milk and blow, and it creates bubbles. You put air in a thick substance. Yes?
The compost that you use to make the tea, what do you think about leaf mold?
For making compost tea, again, if you're just using leaf mold, then it's not compost tea because it's not necessarily compost.
What about composted leaves?
Yeah, if it were just composted leaves, I mean, if it were like composted, yeah.
It's the bottom of the leaf pile because I have abundance of that. And I use that with worm castings.
You're not going to get a super amount of diversity of microorganisms from that.
I do, because I look under the microscope, but I sprayed my beans and I didn't have any bee bugs.
Cool. I mean, it's not going to be bad. Yeah. I don't know what it's going to, I'm trying to get across, I don't know what it's going to add, but I don't think it's going to do anything bad.
You never used it?
No.
No, not just leaves.
You can actually see the pathogens in a microscope.
If you know the different types of bacteria to look for, so there's like spirillum that looks like a spiral, that's a type. There's different types of anaerobic bacteria that I know to look for and to keep an eye out for, yeah. And so it's just having a knowledge of that.
A vortex brewer, is that just a fancy, have you heard of that?
Yeah.
Is that just for looks?
His question was about a vortex brewer. Vortex brewer is, for those of you who have not heard of a vortex brewer, a vortex brewer uses that same conical brew style, but instead of just pushing water up through this way, it has these three, let's see here. So if this was a top view of the brewer, you've got either 3 or 4 areas on the side that's also pushing water in one direction. So you'll have a hose. It's kind of hard to explain without a good visual, but you got hoses coming up that are creating a vortex in the water. There's not a lot of study with water. There's a good amount of talk lately about like the quality of water, and there's a whole realm of stuff that you can get into with water that is not understandable, that like, like biodynamic stuff, like what happens when you create a vortex of water. And this is, I mean, like, it's too complicated for me. I think that there are benefits to having a vortex and creating a vortex, like for the energies that are created with it. And I'm not trying to get all foo-foo or whatever, but there is something about that to the water. But in my opinion, you want to keep your brewer as simple as possible because you want to be able to clean it after every time. And if you aren't able to clean all the little pieces and pipes, you could have a buildup of biofilm and start to breed bad stuff in your brews. So when you've got multiple hoses coming in, so you've got water coming through here, coming out there, coming out there. Like, how do you get all that stuff clean? It's just too much to clean, in my opinion. It's too much hassle and work for what it might be worth, and that's just my opinion.
I think I have one of these pumps that was in 50 gallons, but I do up tea in 5 gallons. Is going to be a problem if there's too much air being circulated?
There can be too much air in that it's like violently being thrown around. You want 6 parts per million of air in your water. That's going to keep it aerobic. And if you don't have a meter to test that, if you look at your water and it looks like a rolling boil, then you should have enough air going through there. And as far as too much, it's hard. It can be hard to say what's too much, but if it's like splashing out and like really violent, then you can kind of tell that it's too much air.
And also, I was told that if you use a drill, or this is what I've done in the past, with a paint stir, and you do it counterclockwise, that puts air into the water.
Well, yeah, anytime you're stirring water, it's going to be putting air into it. And like biodynamic people do a thing where this again is like the energy thing where they stir it one way, or even, I'm not going to get too far into this because it's totally off topic in a way, but biodynamic people will like even use a right hand to stir clockwise and then a left hand to stir counterclockwise, or a male to stir clockwise and then a female, because you're getting yin and yang energies. And again, I don't need to get into all that, but that's the kind of the thinking behind that. But yeah, stirring it is going to air into it. If you didn't have an air pump, you could stir, like go out and stir every so often to keep it aerated. It just might be a little more difficult.
It's actually a comment, Troy. I don't think you're intending it, but because you're trying to emphasize that soil extract shouldn't be used for foliar, you can almost mislead, because I don't think you ever mentioned that compost tea is fine for soil.
Yes.
You use compost tea to drench the soil anytime, it's fine.
Yes.
It has to be good for foliar too.
Right. So yes, I maybe didn't make that clear when I was explaining that. If you were only doing a soil application, you really only need an extract. If you're doing a foliar application and soil application, so like when I'm going out and spraying lawns or landscapes, I use a compost tea for both. I'll walk up to a plant and hit the foliage, and then I'll hold it down at the root zone and I'll soak the soil with the compost tea as well. So yeah, you don't have to only use compost tea for foliar feeding and only use extract for soil. It's just that it has been found that when you're brewing tea, the glues that are made by the microorganisms help for the microorganisms to stick to the plant surfaces. So yes, thank you. And then there was I have a question right here. She's been waiting.
Is compost tea versus vermicompost tea, is there one that's better than the other with results?
I like to, if I have both on hand, I like to mix both, because it's all about the diversity of microorganisms. Usually it's better to go with worm compost. I mean, it kind of depends on the fungal to bacterial ratio again, if you were to look at that. But normally, across the board, it would be better to use worm compost, because worm compost has gonna normally have the same microorganisms that compost has, but as worms work their way through material, they have biology in their gut that the material that gets passed through worms is getting inoculated with more beneficial bacteria along with growth hormones. So you're getting the benefit of all that as well. Yeah, vermicompost has been proven to be superior in different ways usually to regular compost. But yeah, I like to mix them both. Can we move on?
I have a question about shelf life. There you go, thank you.